It landed like a dropped mic, a short, sharp set of comments from Joni Lamb that turned into a social media wildfire and forced millions to ask whether the face they trusted on Christian television was hiding something far darker. If you want to keep up with this story as it develops, hit subscribe now and turn on the bell for first-hand updates. We'll follow police news, family statements, and every major development so you don't miss the facts as they come out. The sequence that followed those comments, the outrage, the defense, and the deeper reporting, hasn't been a tidy scandal you can file away and forget. It has been a slow-motion collapse, a public family breakup that raises uncomfortable questions about power, loyalty, and how institutions that claim moral authority respond when their own people are accused. What started as a single interview clip ballooned into a full-blown controversy because it touched something raw, the collision between private pain and public performance, a place where the consequences are real for children, employees, viewers, and donors alike. To understand why this moment is so volatile, you need to see the full picture. The short clip and the louder sound bites are only the top of the iceberg. Behind them sits a timeline stretching back years, allegations that a child was harmed, family meetings that some say were attempts to smooth things over, staff changes that looked suspicious to outsiders, and a network that for decades presented itself as a safe harbor for believers. People tuned into Daystar expecting inspiration. Instead they encountered the messy, human consequences of a family-run ministry with enormous power and limited external checks. That gap between expectation and reality explains why reactions have been so heated, audiences feel betrayed, insiders feel trapped, and journalists keep uncovering details that simply don't line up with the polished messaging viewers were used to receiving. What the early viral moments did extraordinarily well was force the conversation into the public square. A small clip shared on a popular channel became a rallying point for critics who had been following fragments of the story for months. For others, it was the first clear sign that this was no ordinary boardroom dispute. The clip didn't explain the whole truth, but it crystallized the emotion. People felt as if a trusted leader had used spiritual language to deflect direct questions, and that perception, more than any single factual claim, drove the outrage. When spiritual leaders respond to hard questions with phrases about prayer, sovereignty, and forgiveness, many people see comfort. But when those words appear to be used to close down inquiry or shift blame, they look like a tactic. That distinction, between pastoral comfort and defensive obfuscation, is what made those early minutes of footage so combustible. Equally important is the context, allegations that a family member harmed a child and that the family, for reasons that remain contested, tried to manage the fallout internally rather than calling authorities and supporting the victim through outside channels. Those are not casual accusations. They are the kind of claims that touch the bedrock of what people expect from religious institutions: protection of the vulnerable, clear reporting, and pastoral care rather than damage control. When people learned that police initially closed an inquiry, then reopened it, and then that trusted voices were telling different stories about what happened behind closed doors, the public's tolerance for generic spiritual statements collapsed. The clip magnified that collapse because it suggested defensiveness rather than contrition. So the first thing to understand is this: what seems like a short moment of rhetoric is actually the hinge on which a very long story swings. The clip crystallized skepticism and became shorthand for much broader concerns. Viewers weren't just asking whether a single sentence was fair, they were asking whether an entire leadership culture had prioritized preservation of image over pastoral duty. That's a heavy charge, and it's why this issue kept growing. People who had previously given the network the benefit of the doubt began to rehearse the more painful possibility that the ministry's internal dynamics had allowed harm to be minimized in the name of loyalty. When Joni spoke, listeners heard a string of soundbites that, stripped of context, read like defenses. The words that generated the most heat were not long theological essays but short, forceful lines that felt to many like a way of deflecting scrutiny. Critics claimed these were less about explanation and more about control, about claiming the moral high ground while closing off meaningful investigation. Supporters countered that the language was pastoral, that Joni was inviting prayer rather than issuing an official legal statement, and that anyone who parsed her words through the hostile lens of social media would naturally miss nuance. Both sides used the same clips to tell very different stories, and that binary has been driving the debate ever since. What's tricky is how quickly spiritual phrases become public currency. A line about trusting God sounds, in a sermon, like comfort. In a crisis, it can sound like a command not to dig deeper. That's why the medium matters. When a network's leader repeats such phrases on a program that reaches millions, it carries institutional weight. People don't hear it as private consolation between friends, they hear it as institutional posture. That's why the initial clip mattered so much, because it was not a private line. It was framed for broadcast. And when spiritual speech becomes official posture, questions about motives, timing, and truth follow very quickly. The second major strand of this story is the body of reported allegations and the family dynamics that have played out publicly as a result. Jonathan and Susie Lamb's account, that their young daughter disclosed abuse and that family leaders discouraged going to the police, is the core of why so many people have been outraged. These are, by nature, sensitive claims. Reporting and commentary must be careful, allegations are not convictions, and families dealing with trauma need discretion and due process. Yet the mechanics of the reported sequence, disclosure, internal family handling, a police report that initially closed, followed by a reopening, raises important governance questions for any ministry, and especially for one run like a family business. The first public step from Jonathan and Susie was to inform family leadership and, as they reported, involve local law enforcement. What drives public unease is not just the allegation itself but the way the case was, according to critics, managed, counseling or internal reviews rather than outside investigation, family meetings where the emphasis seemed to be reconciliation and forgiveness rather than the protection of the child, and an independent fact-finding process. For observers who expect religious communities to be models for protecting vulnerable people, the idea that internal loyalty might trump child safety is intolerable. Board structure and governance come into play hard here. Daystar has operated for years as a family-led enterprise. That model can produce efficiency and unity, but it can also create conflicts of interest when family and governance lines blur. When the person at the top is both family matriarch and corporate head, decisions about personnel, finances, and remedial action naturally invite questions about impartiality. Critics argue that a family-run structure without independent oversight invites the very outcome many are now worrying about, the suppression of complaints to avoid embarrassment or loss of influence. Jonathan's dismissal from his professional role at the network, followed by his public allegations, created optics that were difficult to counter. Daystar's official position has framed his departure as a personnel matter tied to performance or insubordination. To the company, it is a human resources decision. To many outside observers, the timing looked like a coordinated effort to prevent internal criticism from turning public. Those divergent frames are where the dispute resides. One narrative says organizational necessity, another says quelling dissent. Which account you believe will depend, for many, on how much you trust the institution versus the accusers. The law added its own layer of complexity. The fact that investigators reopened the case after previously closing it suggests there was new information or that prior inquiries were incomplete. Reopened investigations are not indictments, they are procedural moves that reflect the evolving state of evidence. Still, for public trust, a reopened probe is a powerful signal that the matter warranted another look. For critics of Daystar's internal handling, the reopening confirmed suspicions that something had been handled poorly the first time. For defenders, it remains a sign that due process should run its course, no rush to judgment. That tension, the legal procedural posture versus the moral urgency expressed by many viewers, defines the second major strand of this story. This is where governance reforms matter. Independent auditing of how allegations are handled, transparent reporting to law enforcement when warranted, and boards with non-family members who have real oversight authority are not just corporate niceties, they are mechanisms that protect the vulnerable and preserve institutional integrity. Observers asking for such measures are not seeking to vilify leaders, they are asking for basic safeguards any responsible organization should have. Another strand that has fueled public reaction is the social media explosion that followed the viral clips. Platforms amplified outrage, and outrage became a force multiplier. Screenshots, opinion pieces, and hashtags created a feedback loop that pressured partners, advertisers, and program hosts to reassess their relationships with the network. Some longtime partners publicly paused broadcasts or withdrew programming. Donors posted questions. Viewers cancelled pledges. Digital outrage led quickly to real-world consequences because modern media compresses the distance between perception and financial reality. Social platforms are blunt instruments. They encourage rapid moral judgments and reward striking narratives. A single short clip can shape public perception faster than months of careful investigation. That speed has pros and cons. It forces institutions to respond quickly, but it also pressures them to offer immediate statements that may be incomplete or defensive. Daystar's initial responses, emphasizing cooperation with law enforcement, asserting that previous internal reviews cleared personnel, and framing departures as contractual normalcy, did not convince everyone, because the social narrative had already taken on a life of its own. For many users, statements that read as legalistic or performative felt like more spin. But social media did more than spread outrage. It also created space for people with related experiences to speak up: former staffers, viewers who had felt dismissed by ministries before, and abuse survivors who saw pattern recognition. Those voices broadened the conversation from a single family dispute to systemic questions. How do ministries handle money? Who holds leaders accountable? Are victim-survivor protections robust enough? The amplification of those questions by ordinary users turned a private family conflict into a sector-wide debate about how religious institutions govern themselves. The institutional response and the media updates form another crucial part of this story. Once the police reopened the case in 2023, media outlets took a closer look. Investigative reporters dug into internal emails, board minutes were available, and the public statements that Daystar and family members issued. Religion-focused reporters, some who had tracked Daystar for years, placed the controversy within a broader pattern of problems that can afflict large, personality-driven ministries: concentration of power, insufficient board independence, and the temptation to prioritize donor relations over transparency. Daystar's responses have been a mix of legal caution and pastoral language. The network emphasized cooperation with law enforcement, prayed publicly for healing, and framed the family disagreements as matters of private reconciliation. That combination of legal and spiritual posture is understandable from an organizational perspective. Legal counsel warns against saying anything that might interfere with investigations, while pastoral instincts push toward forgiveness. But critics argue that such mixed messaging often reads as evasive when not accompanied by clear, actionable reforms, independent investigations, public disclosure of policies, and a transparent roadmap for change. The financial allegations that surfaced alongside the abuse story complicated matters. Reports that ministry funds were used for personal benefits, or that key salaries rose substantially after leadership changes, amplified the moral questions. Donors asked whether their contribution supported ministry work or perpetuated an insulated family network that protected insiders. When stewardship concerns collate with protective family dynamics, public trust quickly erodes. Even if financial irregularities are ultimately found innocent or within legal bounds, the perception of impropriety is damaging when combined with unresolved abuse allegations. So where does this leave Daystar and its leadership? The implications are serious and multi-layered. On a practical level, the network risks losing donors, programming partners, and viewer goodwill, the very assets that fund operations. Several high-profile ministries paused broadcasts or publicly distanced themselves, signaling to viewers that affiliation is not automatic in times of scandal. Financially, losing partners can be devastating. Reputationally, regaining trust after such breaches is arduous and often takes years of demonstrable, structural change. On a pastoral level, the damage is deeper. When a ministry that preaches moral clarity is seen as mishandling allegations and protecting insiders, congregants feel betrayed. The wound is not only about money or personnel, it is about spiritual leadership. People entrusted their souls, their stories, and sometimes their livelihoods to institutions that promised sanctity and safety. When those promises appear compromised, the disillusionment is profound. That brings us to the final, and perhaps most important, point: the path forward. The most credible route to restoring trust runs through transparency, independent oversight, and tangible reforms. That means public disclosure of governance changes, a commitment to independent investigations for allegations of abuse, stronger whistleblower protections for staff and family members, and financial audits conducted by trusted third parties. It also means pastoral humility. Leaders must not only pray for healing but demonstrate practical steps that protect the vulnerable and ensure that words of repentance are matched by policy changes. Some of the strongest voices in this debate are not people seeking to destroy a ministry but those calling for basic safeguards that protect everyone, victims, staff, and honest leaders who serve faithfully. The demand is simple: when institutions handle accusations properly and openly, everyone benefits. When institutions prioritize reputation over truth, vulnerabilities are left exposed and the ministry itself becomes the victim of its own defense mechanisms. This story isn't over. There will be legal updates, public statements, and perhaps more disclosures from family members or former insiders. What matters most for viewers and for the faith community is how leaders respond, with constructive reforms, with genuine accountability, and with an honest willingness to put the welfare of the vulnerable ahead of organizational preservation. If that happens, this painful chapter could lead to needed reforms across other ministries. If it doesn't, the damage will have long-term consequences for public trust in religious broadcasting and for the families who rely on such ministries for counsel and care. For anyone who has been following this, the lesson is clear: demand transparency, insist on independent oversight, and remember that spiritual rhetoric must never replace practical protection. Subscribe and turn on the bell to get the next updates as investigators, family members, and the network respond. The truth matters more than reputation, and how leaders act now will determine whether healing is possible or whether this becomes yet another cautionary tale about unchecked power in religious institutions.